All yours, sir. All yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Good to see you all. A fantastic conference. My name is Najib Al-Hassin. I'm the country director for the World Bank, and I'm very happy to have to chair this exciting panel on opportunities for firms to grow. And I'm happy to have with us Mr. Mohammed Ahmed Zubair, who's the chief economist in the Planning Commission of Pakistan, Mr. Turab Hussain, associate professor at LUMS, Mrs. Zahra Aslam, who's an economist with the World Bank here in Pakistan, and Mr. Omar Siddiq, who's senior research economist at PIDE. So, very important topic. Growth comes from firms, whatever forms they take. We've talked earlier today about the role of the state. I want to focus this discussion today not only on the opportunities for firms, but more importantly, what's the role of public policy to enable firms to grasp the opportunities for growth. But let me start by asking Mr. Zubair, from the governance perspective, if you can tell us a little bit, how do you see the growth perspective in Pakistan? Where will it come from in the future? What types of firms will drive the growth we are all hoping for?
Thank you, Najib. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Pakistan's economic contraction, we reversed that in a rather V-shaped fashion from minus 0.4% in fiscal year 20 to 3.5% in fiscal year 21. And this story is well known. So let me share the government's perspective on what has happened in the last few months, particularly the first quarter of this fiscal year. So the fiscal year 22 started with the positive prospects, and there was a robust recovery in aggregate demand, which is evident from rise in imports, car sales, consumer credit, electricity consumption, and the budget of the fiscal year 22 also contributed both from the current expenditure and the development expenditure to support the continuation of the economic recovery which was observed in fiscal year 21. The output of Kharif crops is set to post another record production. However, we know that this sort of recovery, you see, if we go back to fiscal year FY21, there were really two major drivers of growth, apart from the fact that the COVID management helped to abate the economic slowdown. One was that there was a massive transfer to the agriculture sector amounting to about 1.1 trillion rupees. And this was also accompanied by record remittances inflows of 27 billion. And then this government budget for FY22 added to the acceleration of the aggregate demand impulses. So as a result, during the first quarter of this fiscal year 22, we saw the import growth rising rather sharply, and we also observed building up of external imbalances. So the imports surged to the highest level of 17.5 billion in the first quarter of 22. Fiscal year 22, and the current account deficit was 3.4 billion in the first quarter. And we have also seen the resurgence of inflationary impulses in the economy. Now, if we look at the exports, they recorded the highest average monthly level of 2.4 billion in the first quarter of fiscal 22, as well as the highest ever in a single quarter of 7.2 billion And the remittances have also, touched 8 billion mark during the first quarter of 22. Now, the government is very much aware of the need to preserve the momentum of recovery and keeping the external balances in check. In past few days, there has been a staff level agreement with the IMF, and there is already, even before the reaching of the staff level agreement with the IMF, given the early signs that we observe of emerging fiscal balances in the first quarter of 22, fiscal retrenchment process is already underway, and the numbers have not been finalized in terms of the extent of scaling down the PSDP. But certainly in the Planning Commission, we are looking very closely on the size of the scale down. At the same time, the central bank has also raised the policy rate, and we believe that along with the exchange rate management, this would sort of stabilize the external balance account. Now, your question was about the future prospects of growth. What would be the drivers of the growth? I think this is our many decades old problem that the macroeconomic stability has dominated the overall growth prospects, and the fact that under the IMF staff program, some of the fiscal concessions that were delivered in the budget would be withdrawn. Without sort of like stabilizing the macroeconomic picture, at least at the industry level, it is exceedingly difficult to see the industry sector as main driver of the growth. The main drivers of the growth are likely to, as has been demonstrated in the last couple of years, from the agriculture sector, and also extremely positive developments in the services sector led by the rising exports of the IT. So in the near term, these two sectors appear to be the main drivers of the growth.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this macro picture and the prospects. We're going to slowly zoom down on the firms, but let me turn to productivity and ask from our colleague from Turab, from Omar, sorry, starting with Omar, on the work you have done on productivity in Pakistan over the past decades.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So, first of all, why is total factor productivity important? My work is, by the way, on an overview of total factor productivity in Pakistan since 1972. So, first of all, why is total factor productivity important? I think it's a well-known fact that it contributes to economic growth. For example, in the second industrial revolution, when technological progress took place, it led to unprecedented growth. And if we look at some of the recent evidence, it shows that in G5, G7, and G20 countries, total TFP growth has led to income growth rather than factor accumulation. And Warren Buffett has termed TFP growth as the secret sauce of success in America, as gains growth over the last century or so. So without productivity gains, there is no genuine increases in income and prosperity. So if we look at Pakistan, when let's state the obvious first, that since 1972, and even if we look even further back, Pakistan's TFP growth, economic growth, and investment to GDP ratio, all three critical indicators are on the decline. And although, according to my calculations, estimations, TFP growth since 1972 has been 1.62%, which is respectable if compared to countries like India, but it is very low as compared to other East Asian economies. So whenever there has been TFP growth, there has been surge in economic growth. Although it does not establish causality, to establish causality we have to look into deeper determinants. But the literature and other countries' experiences show that TFP growth leads to economic growth. And there is a study by City GPS India which shows that in 60% of the cases they looked at, whenever a country has grown at, whenever a country's TFP has grown at 3% or higher, their GDP has grown at 8% and above. The case in point is that of China. So if we break down the TFP growth according to decades, Pakistan's TFP was in 80s was quite high. In 90s it blipped, and in 2000s it increased. And what's, according to my analysis, that what's puzzling is, although the growth in the last decade has decreased, but the TFP has increased, and also the investment rate was quite low in that decades. So in the 1980s, there was an increasing role of the private sector, and there were import liberalization and large-scale public investment that led to high growth and GDP. And if we look at the 1990s, when TFP growth declined, the GDP growth also declined, and 1990s it's sometimes called as last decades. It's quite interesting that although there were quite a few liberalization measures that were taken in the 1990s, but still those did not translate into high TFP growth or GDP growth. That's probably because the sequencing was not right, and also because there was a hangover of large borrowing from the 1980s, which led to downturn in TFP and GDP growth. So if we look at 2000s, in the decade of 2000s, the TFP growth increased and also the GDP growth increased. Broadly, the factors that led to such a development were trade openness and financial debt. There was also privatization process, and there was also focus of the policy on the banking sector, financial liberalization, and also one important factor that led to higher growth was the relaxation of sanctions post September 2001, which improved the economic conditions. So in 2010s, TFP increased, but the GDP growth decreased. Why that happened? That's probably because in the latter half of the 2000s, there was investment, but there was probably idle capacity lying that was utilized in the 2010s that led to such growth. So in sum, since 1972, the most of the growth has been in Pakistan has been input driven and not TFP driven. And as Krugman and Alvin Young has shown, that whenever the growth is driven by input accumulation, it is not very sustainable. So, and again, if we look at the main sectors, that is agriculture, industry, and services, in all those follow the same trends that in 70s it was respectable, and then in 80s the TFP increased in all these sectors, and then in 90s it decreased, and so on and so forth. So we can say that whenever there have been episodes of privatization, liberalization, and financial openness, even when trade openness have increased, it has led to increase in TFP growth, and consequently it has led to increase in GDP growth.
Thanks a lot. This disconnect between TFP growth and GDP growth in the 2010s
yes.
is
quite
interesting.
Yeah, it is very interesting. So to be very frank, I cannot think of any plausible explanation for that. So I think.
So to be very frank as well, I never really understood exactly or could picture what's inside TFP. It's a very it's a residual of an equation. And so let's move from TFP, because productivity growth happens where production takes place, and that's inside the firms. So let's move inside the firms, and I'm turning to Zahra, who's doing interesting work, a growth diagnostics that looks at large firms. We'll start with large firms to try to understand how are they an active agent of growth? Are there many large firms? Large firms live longer, they dominate exports. So tell us a little bit about the large firms' dynamics in Pakistan, then we'll move to smaller firms.
Thank you, Naji. So large firms, as Naji mentioned, are important as large and globally integrated firms. They enjoy large economies of scale. They can also tap into global knowledge pools, and this can lead to an increase in productivity, over time investment, and they can also be engines of employment generation. Moreover, the externalities and spillover effects associated with large firms are also beneficial for small firms, and they can help increase the learning and size of small firms through knowledge spillovers, as well as increased demand. So keeping this in mind, we can see that a large number of larger firms can in turn lead to higher potential growth for an economy. And in this context, we are trying to understand in Pakistan what are the firm level sort of dynamics, and as part of this growth diagnostic, we want to look at firm investment growth and size trends at the firm level. And so we're also at the same time, as part of this analysis, also looking at ownership structure, profitability, productivity, and how these impact firm investment decisions and in turn size and growth. The first part, so I'd like to share some preliminary results here, and the first result directly addresses one of your questions, is on the presence of very large firms. And we find that indeed Pakistan has few large firms, especially in the knowledge intensive sectors. So some of you may be familiar that to understand, because of data constraints, there are challenges to understanding the full sort of firm size distribution in Pakistan. We, for our analysis, use a publicly available data source called Orbis, and we restrict our analysis to large top 500 firms for Pakistan and comparator countries, both that are in terms similar in the structural comparators as well as aspirational comparators. And when by restricting the sample to the top 500, we get a comprehensive picture of large firms. And here again, the main result that we get is that the typical size of a large Pakistani firm is smaller than compared to comparator countries. We then focus on, the ones at the frontier, so firms that exceed their annual sales exceed $1 to $2 billion. And again, these are, we can label them as very large firms. And the result is similar, that Pakistan, when it compares to its other sort of comparators, Vietnam, Indonesia, Turkey, India, it has fewer very large firms. And this is also substantiated by another sort of data source that we use, is on the exporters database. And again, here the results are corroborated. Pakistan has few large exporters and many small exporters. So to put a number here, the average size of a Pakistani exporter is about $1.4 million per annum, and this is a third of our average Bangladeshi exporter. And so now it's also important to look at what are these very large firms doing. And here we find that they primarily exist in the extraction sort of sector. So the two top sectors are utilities, so mining and gas, support services, and gas distribution. And when we compare to structural comparators, structure holes of the very large firms, but aspirational countries tend to have larger knowledge-intensive firms that are in telecom, trade, etc. And the spillovers that I was referring to before in terms of knowledge spillovers for the domestic small firms, they tend to be associated with more knowledge-intensive firms. So that sort of answers part of the question. The second one is on how they are contributing to growth. And here it's important to look at how are these firms growing themselves, what is their profitability, and what are their investment decisions, what do they look like. And so again, the key result here is that we find that firms, large firms tend to experience a weak growth in sales, and it's also volatile. And the share of high growth firms in Pakistan tends to be small. And while there are many factors that can impact an individual firm's growth in terms of sales, the fact that they are operating in sectors where prices are volatile and their small size can contribute to their weak sort of volatility in sales. Similarly, looking at the top end of the distribution in terms of high growth firms is important because these firms again are employment generating firms. They also have vertical links to other firms in the network, and they also reflect what are the dynamics for a business in the country. And again, we find that Pakistan's share of high growth firms is lower than in comparator countries. And so this has direct impact on investment decisions for firms. So the next part is to look at, are firms investing more? And we see that when growth in sales is weak, investment also tends to be lower. So Pakistan's average sort of capital growth of these top 500 firms is lower than comparator countries. A similar analysis on the capital stock of listed firms on the stock exchange show that their capital stock actually depreciates over time because their annual investment does not cover their sort of depreciation costs. And so there could be a shrinking of capital stocks. And this has direct impact on productivity. So firms that will grow large, that will invest more, will benefit from economies of scale and are likely to grow more productive over time. And the benefits of TFP have already been discussed earlier. So keeping this in mind, and then another sort of result that we find which is interesting is that in terms of profitability, Pakistani firms tend to do okay, but there is a large share of loss-making firms. And again, this analysis is relevant because recently, only I think a couple of weeks ago, there was an article in the newspaper, and I think this is research done by PIDE on the existence of zombie firms. So loss-making firms, we define as a loss-making firm, a firm that has been in operation for 10 years and has been loss-making for 3 consecutive years. So while profitability should be linked with high investment, we don't necessarily see that. And one reason could be the existence of these loss-making zombie firms that can depress the overall investment environment and also weak reallocation. And then looking at these zombie firms, we find that they tend to be state-owned or family-owned. And this points towards sort of corporate governance issues or budget constraints that they face. And these are the loss-making firms that we see. So overall, when there are small and few large growing firms, this has a direct impact on employment generation and having more labor in the formal sector. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Zahra. When will the study be published? So that all the audience will...
So we are expecting to publish this by June next year. So yes,
okay.
We will.
So one may ask, we'll move to SMEs, but I just want to have, please.
I need to ask a question.
Go ahead.
Zahra, do you think this zombie firm phenomena has also to do with the prudential regulations of the central bank, in the sense that if the bank have to recognize non-performing loans portfolio, then there is a provisioning that needs to be done, and it gets adds to the cost of the financial intermediation. So it's better to restructure the loan and keep the zombie firm going.
So I think that's a very important question that we also are trying to raise, that why do these firms continue to exist year on year, and why are they able to get the budget that they need? And again, I think part of this could be through the prudential regulations, but also the structure, as we identified that family-owned firms tend to have more loss, tend to persistently be loss-making. So now that is a question of why these family-owned firms continue to get credit. And again, why can they restructure loans and still survive even though they're loss making? Thank you.
I appreciate, Mohammed, that you asked the question focusing on the policy environment, because after all, why would the size distribution of firms matter? Why are you focusing on large firms and then on SMEs? We've seen very different profiles of size distribution of countries growing, sometimes driven by SMEs, sometimes driven by large firms. But when you hear analysis that shows that you have, among the large firms, fewer ones, some of them very profitable, others making sustained losses without exiting the market, these are signs of insufficient competition, probably, insufficient entry and exit, which is at the core of growth accelerations across countries. And we know, speaking of large firms, we know it matters for exports. That's consistent finding over the recent years, that across country exports tend to be very concentrated in a few large firms. So performance of large firms actually matter, but SMEs matter as well. So tell us about your work on SMEs, the picture of SMEs in Pakistan. What's an SME, and how are they doing?
Okay, thank you very much, Naji, and I'm really happy to be in Peshawar, and thank you very much for organizing such a wonderful conference. So on SMEs, so one thing which we need to understand is, if you look at all economic activity across sectors, agriculture, services and manufacturing, around 95 to 96%, in fact even more perhaps, is SMEs, small medium enterprises. The way we define SMEs, and this is sort of a controversial topic, but let's not get into the controversy. The State Bank definition is that anything which is $850 million rupees less annual turnover and 250 employees less is an SME. Okay, so that means almost 98% of economic activity in the country. So that aside, so we know that most of the economic activity happens within SMEs. Now, to look at performance of SMEs over the years, let me take a sort of a bird's eye view and longitudinal way of looking at that performance. So first thing which one looks at is the distribution across, that how many have graduated from small to medium and from medium to large. So a snapshot of that comes from the Census of Manufacturing and Industries, which was conducted in 2005, and the latest one was in 2015-16. Results have just come out. And I was just looking at that, and well, surprisingly and also interestingly, 94% to 95% of firms are, in 2005, manufacturing firms were small enterprises, and 2015-16, the percentage remains the same. So the graduation from small to medium and medium to large has been really, really low in the country. That is one sign of dynamism or lack of dynamism. The second thing which one looks at in terms of performance, again looking at a macro picture or a bird's eye view, is looking at export to GDP or Pakistan's export share in world exports. And what we see here, that yes, you might have had periods where exports have gone up slightly compared to our average, but over a 30-year period, it's fairly stagnant and static. Okay? Then third, if you look at your product space, say in manufacturing, you want to look at what sort of products you produce. Go back 30 years, look at it today, it hasn't changed that much. So that's been pretty static. You look at Hausmann, students are here, you look at Hausmann's complexity index, some excellent rich data there. You look at Pakistan 20 years ago, 20 years now, today, again, your product space has not changed. So we have not diversified. So we're stuck at the low end of the value chain. We're not integrated into the global value chains and so on. So that's just performance. Now, looking at sort of it a bit deeply from bird's eye view, going into a more microscopic, if you may, view. So we did a study, this was some time ago, and we were looking at what appears to be a dynamic cluster in Pakistan. You all have heard of the Golden Triangle. You know, you have Gujarat, Gujranwala, Wazirabad, Sialkot. 27-28% of your industry is there. It's a hub of exports also. So we asked this very simple question from firms. It was a quantitative and qualitative exercise. trying to figure out why is it that they don't grow? Why is it that small firms don't become medium and medium find it hard to become large? And we came across some interesting results, and I'll just very briefly share them with you. So we looked at, within light engineering, we looked at the fans industry, which is around Gujranwala, Gujarat, Wazirabad, and sports good industry, which is in Sialkot. And although they're neighboring districts, it was as if there were two different worlds altogether. So the fan industry, with the exception of 3 or 4 players, which take almost 70% of the market, the residual is distributed among small players. Average size employees around 8 to 9. The proprietor or the owner, by and large, is from a laborer became a proprietor or an owner. No access to credit, does not know how to do accounts, so does not even know whether the firm is profitable or not, has access to credit from the informal market, which is at a very high rate. There's price competition, so the whole effort is to try and get cheaper inputs and absolutely no standardization, sell to the domestic market. You'll find very few players within that category who are able to graduate and become exporters. Generally speaking, they're just supplying to the domestic market. And then you have succession issues. Down the second, third generation, diseconomies of scale happen. There's absolutely no question of professional management. So they disintegrate. So very, very low survival rate. So, they exist for 10, 15 years, then they'll die out. So that was the story of the fan industry. Now you go across this other district, Sialkot, and it was so illuminating. And here we're doing a comparison within Pakistan. We're not looking at Pakistan and other countries. So, outward oriented, very focused on the international market. We interviewed proprietors in the sports good industry. General trend was you moved from a trader to an owner, to a manufacturer. Okay, so through trading, they got their contacts, and they were in a cultural milieu also of sort of having these international linkages, which I'm sure helped. Average years of education, a college degree generally, very, very innovative. You've all heard of, I shouldn't be naming names, but here, forward sports. So there was a time when the soccer industry got into problem because of child labor laws. And notwithstanding whatever the government did was completely ineffectual, trying to sort of, again, come up with thermobonded balls, which China used to manufacture, and we did not have technology. But here's one firm which came up, reverse engineered, came up with this technology, and now we're back in the market. We're now exporting soccer balls worldwide, and in the last World Cup we featured majorly in that. Anyway, so completely different characteristics just across the border, just a different district. Then you look at the surgical industry. Now that's also a cluster which seems to be sort of doing well, but it's interesting to see that one of the reasons why that cluster is here in Pakistan is because we have a comparative advantage in a particular skill. We've traditionally had labor which does grinding and polishing. Now that's a huge health hazard, and the second generation, the Shagirds, are not willing to go into the market. So the cluster was really, they were worried that what's going to happen if this generation of worker goes, they'll be in a soup. And imagine if someday, like China came up with thermobonded technology and that hurt our sports goods sector, if someday a country, maybe neighboring China, comes up with a technology for polishing and grinding these surgical instruments, then this cluster is going to disappear. So, you have stories of vulnerability and stories of perseverance and success across. So that's my 2 cents, just to give you an illustration of what things look like in the Golden Triangle.
Excellent. So it's very, very, very enlightening. Very, very enlightening. Let's move to the second part of the discussion to focus on what governments can do or should not do or should intervene, possibly at the firm level to spur productivity growth. So let me start with Omer. Anything that the government should do to spur productivity at the firm level?
Well, I think the evidence that is overwhelming that if you let the markets work and let the private sector's dynamism, take its course, it will eventually lead to higher productivity growth. And there is literature available that shows that if you deregulate and the government's intervention is decreased. By the way, PIDE research has shown that government's footprint on Pakistan's economy is to the tune of 60 to 80%. So that's huge. So that leaves very little resources for the private sectors and very little role of the private sector to work efficiently. Similarly, the literature also shows that the governance and institutions, for example, there is also very interesting work being done at PIDE called the Sludge series, which shows that when you start a business, you have to go through a plethora of steps to establish a business, and it costs you a lot of time. It has a monetary cost, it has psychological costs, and sometimes the cost, if we lump these costs together, they amount to millions of rupees. So if these energies are diverted towards doing such things, then the private sector won't be able to work. Similarly, there are institutions, for example, the legal institutions in Pakistan are very inefficient. We looked at the amount of time it takes to conclude a litigation in Pakistan. It is usually around 25 years. So again, it diverts energy and resources towards doing these things. Then if Pakistan experience and other countries' experience has shown that if you let the export sector flourish, and if you remove certain restrictions like tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers, and so this will also lead to higher productivity growth. This is good also for true for at the micro level and at the macro level. So when we talk about market-oriented reforms, the general misconception is that everything is left to the market forces and government has no role to play. That's not true. What we mean when we talk about, and we have argued that very rigorously in our growth agenda, that market-oriented reforms and letting market do their job does not mean that government has no role to play. Of course, government has a role to play. Government has to, regulate efficiently. Government has to, if the investment is taking place, they have to monitor it and all these things. And again, overall stability can lead to all these things. I've also doing a preliminary work on the determinants of TFP growth in Pakistan. First, a disclaimer: doing econometric work in Pakistan, especially on such topics, is a very painful experience because of the lack of data. You do not find data, so these results can only be taken as indicative. So I took IMF dummy as a determinant of TFP, openness, education, infrastructure, and innovation, and credit to GDP ratio. So the results are very interesting. The IMF dummy that from 1972 to 2019 is negative and significant. So the IMF programs contribute, unfortunately, negatively to the overall growth environment of Pakistan. Openness, unsurprisingly, has positive influence surprisingly, education has negative influence, and similarly the case is with the infrastructure. So why is infrastructure have negative influence? Because the global evidence shows that infrastructure, investment in infrastructure has positive contribution towards TFP and GDP growth. That's because, probably because that when we invest in infrastructure, that is without any regard to its efficiency, whether it is useful or not, and some the infrastructure projects go beyond their stipulated time frame during which it has to be completed. And finally, the credit to GDP ratio, which shows the financial sector's debt, has a positive and significant impact on TFP growth in Pakistan. So in sum, let the private sector work with market-oriented reforms, improve the governance structure. That is, sort of become, has become, tautology in Pakistan, that let governance work. But as I mentioned earlier, that we have shown by research at PIDE that the governance structure and institutions, law institutions and all those bureaucracy, these need to be, reformed so that the real spirit of the private sector can be unleashed. Thank you.
Thank you. So that's one view. Don't intervene, just let markets play, improve the environment, unlock the barriers and open up. That is one view. Turab, you've brilliantly exposed differences inside the country between clusters. Any lessons from this analysis on what any role the government had in these clusters in Sialkot or elsewhere, or is it just traditions and different relations to business that make such big differences in success?
So
and what the government could do, if anything?
That's a very good question. I'll go back to another piece of work which we did around a decade ago, and this was for the federal government, and it was industrial policy of Pakistan. So when you say industrial policy, people think, oh my God, it's heterodox, but it was very different. But anyway, so during the time when we were doing it, we were in the middle of a major electricity crisis. You'd remember, many hours of shortages and so on, and industry was really suffering. So we had to do field work, and we went around all the major clusters, cities, wherever the industry was, met the chambers, met the associations. Now, one thing which came out, which is sort of in some sense tries to capture the question you asked, is that they used to say that we just give us electricity and just forget about us. So in the case of this country, if you see a manufacturing enterprise or any enterprise functioning, it's despite the government. It's despite the government. So when you say policy, the first thing which they think about is some form of maybe regulation or whatever. So unfortunately, there's a lot of skepticism in the private sector when you talk about the government. The general view is, leave us alone and we'll do our work. But we don't live in that environment. We have governments, we have regulations and so on. Now, coming to SMEs, we recently again did this SME work. It was an SME policy in 2018. It's in some form of implementation now. But it worked under certain principles. The first principle, and these are basic economics 101, that government intervention has to be there only if there's a market failure. If there's an externality, if there's a market failure because of information asymmetries, whether that be in the labor market, in skills acquisition, in the credit market, so government comes in to correct that market failure. Secondly, government comes in to supply infrastructure, necessary public goods. You can have public-private partnerships there also, but there. Thirdly, government has a regulatory footprint which is predatory, which is too big. We have some excellent work, and I'm pleased to quote that, the sludge economics done by PIDE, which I think everybody should read, which goes into the detail of the cost in terms of time and monetary cost of getting something as simple as an electricity connection. So the third aspect was looking at the regulatory environment. And I'm going to just follow up on what Umar said. So one of the key policy recommendations which we put forward was what is called the regulatory guillotine. Now, regulatory guillotine is, the way it is implemented is through an act of parliament which happens at both the federal level and the provincial level. Okay? And it covers all types of regulations which impact economic activity in the country within the provinces and at the federal level. Okay? So in 2019, Punjab actually passed the Smart Regulation Act. It's in somewhere in implementation stage. I don't know where they are with it. But our major recommendation was to have this regulatory guillotine. Now, how do you work with this regulatory guillotine? So you ask 3 to 4 fundamental questions. 1, whether a regulation is legal. 2, whether the regulation is necessary. 3, regulation is business friendly. And 4, if there's a fee or a license involved, how expensive it is. So, and there are 3 tiers of implementation. One is the department in question, whether that be the labor department, the environment department, or some other department, they, once it is passed, they go through themselves. They look at redundant regulations or regulations which are harmful to industry, to firms, and they strike them off. Then the second tier is it goes to the private sector representative. And the third tier is there's an external evaluator. Now, if you pass that law, and if there's no timeline, these things would never be implemented because the government has absolutely no incentive of doing it. Okay? So we feel that if something like this, a regulatory guillotine, is actually implemented in the country, which deregulates, and we're not saying completely, there are certain regulations which are important, but regulations which are completely redundant are there for centuries, literally for 100 or 50 years or more, okay, which have no relevance now, they should get rid of them. So I think that's my 2 cents on.
All right, so there's consensus on this side of the table. Just get the government out of the way, deregulate. There seems to be
And just
no
one little point.
particular SME policies needed.
So
That's not my view.
horizontal.
I'm the moderator.
Horizontal intervention. Just apologies for this.
Which is the same as
So the regulation is going to have a disproportionate effect. It's going to, a large firm or a medium firm is going to be able to handle FPR or notices from FPR. Small firm won't be.
Understood. So convergence on this side. By the way, I'm no fan of regulatory guillotine at all, but I shouldn't express my disagreements as the panel moderator. But it has failed in other countries. I hope it will work here because there's an ongoing reform guillotine exercise. Let's move to large firms. Zahra, do you agree that it's all about, and large firms are often, not always, but often linked to foreign direct investment. Do you agree there's nothing the government should really do there except to simplify and improve the overall environment, get electricity to flow, or should the government have active intervention to attract FDI or to support certain large firms in certain sectors, which many countries do and have done in the past?
So, you know, so some of the problems that domestic firms in Pakistan face, you can apply the same to FDI, foreign firms as well, and they also have to deal with the regulatory sort of bottlenecks, the difficult regulatory environment, and the sludge that is, you know, being referred to. But for foreign direct investment firms, there's also other policies in place that impact their operation. So just to sort of illustrate, foreign direct investment is regulated by 2 acts, the Investment Act of 1976, Protection Act of 1992, and a foreign policy of 2013. And so while the policy is liberal, it protects and, you know, guarantees certain protection mechanisms to investors. It's not binding, it's a policy, whereas the act is. And these acts and the policy, they can be differences in what they're saying and how they apply to firms. So, you know, policy says firms can invest in any sector. The Act says that they can invest in sectors where there's no primary government presence. The policy says they don't need an NOC. The Act says that, in practice they tend to need a security clearance that can take months. So what they suggest is that there needs to be a harmonization of policies. So whatever differences and discrepancies between the Act and the policy that adversely impact foreign investing firms should be addressed. And it looks fairly simple, but it still exists. The other is that, the legal sort of dispute regulation and contract enforcement, the same way that it impacts domestic firms, also impacts foreign firms. So a survey of overseas sort of investors chamber indicates that firms report that the average time taken for a dispute resolution is more than 5 years. And as mentioned, dispute resolution is accompanied by tangible costs as well as intangible costs, and especially if there are cases which are high, foreign investment cases which are high visibility and get a lot of the traction on news, they can adversely create a negative impact. And for Pakistan, with the security conditions being largely not favorable, this can directly impact investment. So here, to a large extent, I agree that the solution is to simplify and harmonize existing policies, but the government can play a role as well. And here I'd like to sort of illustrate the role that sort of an investment promotion agency can play, and in facilitating investment, so helping develop links with investors, also helping them come and navigate the country, addressing their complaints, so redressal mechanisms, and the role that regional trade agreements can play. So I think it goes hand in hand. So there are ways to simplify and make it easier for firms to operate, but then the government can also play a conducive role in attracting investment. And it's important to note that when we look at foreign investment trends in Pakistan, they are quite low. So average as a percentage of GDP, FDI has been less than 1%. And it's much higher in other countries. So we can say that it doesn't seem that Pakistan is catching up on FDI. It may actually be losing out. So there is a need to address it. And similarly, when it comes to large firms, firms may be staying small because there are size-dependent policies that adversely impact them.
Okay. Thank you very much, Zahra. So, still consensus. I wish I was a speaker in this panel. I would disagree with you and prone. You mentioned market failures. Be curious to know how we measure them, how we identify them. But there's plenty of interventions at the firm level out there. So it's interesting that you're all saying, no, government should just improve the overall environment, maybe soft intervention. So let me turn to Mohammed Saab and end with you before we open it for Q&A. All what we've heard should make your job at the Planning Commission easy. Any proposal you get that's spending money on firm-level interventions or SMEs or large firms, they're telling you, the rest of the panel, not me, is telling you should say no. Is that your view, or do you think government should intervene through industrial policy, through SME policy, in certain sectors to promote firm growth and productivity?
Thank you, Naji. I'll answer this question informally in Urdu and then formally in English. All right.
So that I cannot understand.
No, it's to communicate messages some key messages to the students. I'm sure they understand English, but I can be more effective in Urdu. मेरा ये ख्याल है कि as a society we are very confused, extremely confused. हमारा basically कोई paradigm नहीं है. एक set of principles जिस पे economic principles of policy जिस पे हम vast majority of the various organs of the state, civil society agree करते हो. एक तरफ हम चाहते हैं कि रियासत माँ जैसी हो, हर वक्त इंटरवीन करती रहे, हर काम में टमाटर की प्राइस क्यों बढ़ गई, चिकन की कीमत क्यों बढ़ गई, उसमें इंटरवीन करे. एक तरफ हम चाहते हैं कि गवर्नमेंट सॉवरेन गारंटीज दे 17% डॉलर रिटर्न्स की IPPs को ताकि बिजली आ जाए. एक तरफ मेरे पैनलिस्ट कह रहे हैं कि कोई रेगुलेशन नहीं होनी चाहिए क्योंकि SMEs और लार्ज स्केल. मैं पिछले दिनों एक फोरम में था, मुझे बड़ी हैरानगी हुई कि गवर्नमेंट का बड़ा अजीब सा सिलसिला है कि जहाँ रेगुलेट करना चाहिए वहाँ नहीं करते, जहाँ नहीं करना चाहिए वहाँ कर रहे होते हैं। तो जो सब स्टैंडर्ड इलेक्ट्रिकल और गैस प्रोडक्ट्स मार्केट में हैं, उसकी इकोनॉमिक लॉस जो है, इट कॉस्ट around 1200 megawatts of electricity, equivalent to one Ghazi Barotha dam. तो अब अगर हम वो सब स्टैंडर्ड, तो ये आज सुबह जैसे तैमूर झगड़ा साहब कह रहे थे कि उन्होंने स्पेंडिंग प्लान बनाया, एंड इट वाज अ वेरी प्लेजेंट सरप्राइज फॉर मी कि ही लिंक्ड इट विद द रेवेन्यू प्लान ऑल्सो। तो जनरली अगर आप देखें, हम सब चाहते हैं कि गवर्नमेंट इंटरवीन करे, यहाँ सब्सिडी दे, यहाँ कंसेशन करे, टैक्स कर दे, वगैरह वगैरह। हाउ विल इट फंड? टैक्स रेवेन्यू देने के लिए कोई तैयार, टैक्सेस देने के लिए कोई तैयार नहीं है। नाउ आई नो आई एम इंटरनाइजिंग डॉक्टर नदीम साहब, बट देयर हैज़ टू बी सम बैलेंस ऑफ गिव एंड टेक। पाइड ने बड़ा ज़बरदस्त काम शुरू किया कैलकुलेटिंग द स्टार्टिंग द स्लज सीरीज़। डॉक्टर नदीम साहब कहते हैं कि रिफॉर्म होना चाहिए, बिल्कुल सही है। डॉक्टर इरशद हुसैन साहब कह रहे हैं कि मार्केट वर्सेस स्टेट की बिल्कुल कोई डिबेट नहीं होनी चाहिए, वो भी सही है। और बेसिकली एक कॉम्प्लीमेंट्री रोल है। तो यानी मैं आई एम जस्ट सॉर्ट ऑफ मैं खुद कंफ्यूज हूँ कि हम चाहते क्या हैं, एंड आई एम जस्ट सॉर्ट ऑफ हाईलाइटिंग दिस कि हमारे कोई एक ब्रॉड कंसेंसस नहीं है कि हम मार्केट इकोनॉमी में हैं या हम रियासत जैसी माँ चाहिए, क्या चाहिए मतलब। नाउ आई विल मूव टू लिटिल बिट ऑफ माय फॉर्मल रिस्पॉन्स टू योर क्वेश्चन। यू सी, पाकिस्तान has to, this debate of really, I would like to take it to a very basic fundamental question, which is that I believe Pakistan requires an economic transformation of mindset, policy mindset. And this is primarily because we are stuck, as some of my panelists have mentioned, in a very suboptimal, low-level equilibrium of GDP growth. Total factor productivity is one example of that. And basically, we have lost our economic sovereignty. The mere fact that whenever our GDP growth exceeds 4%, we get into balance of payment problems, and we end up knocking on the doors of the IMF. And we are a repeat offender here. Repeat offenders. So we have had over the past 30 years various growth strategies in the form of various 5-year plans produced as a consensus document by the Planning Commission. But from early 1990s, Pakistan shifted to a market economy structure, and therefore I am arguing in the Planning Commission to revisit the 5-year planning cycle, and in fact we are more or less converging to a view to have a shorter 3-year transformation plan. You see, so far the focus of such plans has been to direct investment resources to existing production structures to generate an increase in output. So this has led to taxes and incentives, tax incentives and subsidies to increasing aggregate output. It has continued to allow misallocation of resources to inefficient sectors. It has also allowed buildup of cartelization and tolerance for cartelization in the industry. And firms are not incentivized to invest in business expansions, as my colleagues have pointed out, both in the large scale and the SME sector. And we have created in niche products oligopolistic market structures. Also, under the IMF and World Bank various support programs, basically what has happened is that these programs, because we are repeat offenders, the focus in the beginning of the programs is usually on stabilization, which actually leads to degradation of the political capital of the incumbent government, and then there is very little appetite left for structural transformation of the economy. So Pakistan doesn't need a growth plan. What we need is an indigenously developed economic transformation strategy that focuses on incentivizing investments in productive sectors and expanding product space in the export market. Ishra Saab this morning was talking about entry-exit barriers and contract enforcement. I would pick his message and say that we should develop an appetite for creative destruction in the economy. We need to develop tolerance for driving out inefficient firms and creating a space for efficient firms. I think of late, there was one word which has now gone out of fashion in policy circles, general discussion in the media, something called sick industries. A few years ago, there used to be very high-powered committees of the central bank, of the FBR, and all sorts of heavy-duty arms of the government dealing with the sick industry phenomena. It's a very particular word that we have, adopted in Pakistan. I believe over the past few years, I have not seen this kind of discussion going around. So hopefully, as a society, we are now discarding this notion of revival of the sick industries. Of course, private sector love this business. They get their debt write-off, they get their debt restructured. So there's a whole set of rent-seeking activities around this barrier to exit. I think we also need to look outwards. It seems, the discussion on economic performance at any given point in time is backward-looking. What happened last year? What happened in the previous government tenure? So it seems, we are benchmarking our government economic performance or government policy outcomes leading to various economic performance measures as if we are in competition with history. What we need to is to reorient, in my view, our thinking to compete with other countries. Countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand. Turkey is perhaps not a good example, but in some ways, it has had very robust industrial policy and export promotion policy. So there are a number of countries which have really accelerated their per capita GDP growth, and we need to benchmark our economic planning, economic outcomes in competition with some other countries. For the benefit of this forum, in the Planning Commission, we did a little exercise, which was that if Pakistan was to adopt somehow TFP growth numbers of Vietnam and invoking ceteris paribus assumptions, it would take 38 years for Pakistan to converge to the Vietnamese GDP per capita. 38 years. So our suboptimal economic performance has been intergenerational, and our recovery would also be intergenerational. That's all. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So no growth plan for Pakistan. Move to 3-year transformation plan. Focus on diversifying the product space. I should note that to achieve that, for those of you who attended the Mahbub al-Haq lecture yesterday by Danny Roderick, it was not specific to Pakistan, but at the end, his end slide to do exactly that was full of, you should intervene, you should subsidize certain sectors, you should intervene at the firm level to spur productivity, which is a bit in contrast to the unanimous statement I heard in this panel. But these agreements are good, debates are good, especially in academic conferences like this. So let's open it up. We have 20 minutes, so we can have a rich exchange. The floor is open. I'll take a first round of 3-4 questions from the audience and distribute them to the panel, or they can volunteer as well. Floor is open.
Assalamu alaikum, sir. Thank you.
Salam.
I am S. Umar and I represent Islamia College Peshawar. I am the final year student of Islamia College Peshawar, BS Economics. Actually, my question is relating to the comparison between these SMEs and large firms. Well, you are, one of them is protecting these SMEs and another is protecting large firms while computing for the GDPs. Now, my question is that assume that, for example, both is having extreme productivity in one case. But have you ever noticed in the trade firms, for example, in Karachi port, our ship has been, I think, 14 days, 14 days they spent on the, on port. 14 days they spent on port just for the tax clearance, right? So if assume that the productivity is already at an extreme point, but we have that barriers in our trade partners, and the ship which is at Singapore, for example, they have cleared our barriers in less than 5 minutes. So please comment on that.
Thank you. So we have the lady there and then the gentleman here. All the way on the third row on the left. Behind you. Yes, thank you.
Hi, my name is Sara Nizamani. I am from IBA Karachi and I'm also associated with PIDE. I'm very happy to see the first woman on stage, so thank you for adding a woman on stage. Thank you. I want to comment by Mohammad Zubair Saab. Sir, you mentioned that real drivers of growth for future are agriculture and services. And undoubtedly, the government is keen or rather desperate to help both. But when it comes to helping by policy, we can see that the government has a remarkable ability to hurt the already existing markets. For example, in agriculture, the wheat support price for this year was 1,800 for 40 kgs, announced by the federal. At the same time, the same government is importing wheat on 2,600 rupees per 40 kgs, and then we wonder why do we have a national shortage. Similarly, in services, our freelancers, despite having one of the poorest infrastructure of internet in the world, they are doing remarkably well, and there's no device ownership. The device ownership for laptops and computers is less than 10%. So instead of giving them opportunities, the government right now is thinking of new ways to tax them. There's a word that was used in the newspaper, crackdown for the freelancers. So what is the kind of signal that we are giving to this remarkable market? So what I'm asking you is, what do you mean? Would you like to let us know, how do you see growth and productivity in these sectors with same kind of policy making? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take one more, please.
Okay, sir, thank you. My name is Rojan, and I am the student of IMS Science University. I am very thankful to you and your colleagues, guests, and student and teacher of Science University, and the teacher and student of different universities. As we know that the economy of a country depend on three factors, like agriculture, production, and services. We are talking about production. When the production is increased, the investment, when we invest more, the production will increase. And when the production is increased, the GDP of a country will be increased. So my question is that the expected return, let's say we are talking about interest. When the interest increase in a state, in a country, it discourages the investor to invest in a production. So my question is that isn't it good that the state reduce the interest rate? And what are the disadvantages if a state reduce the interest rate? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very clear. Please.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My name is Ghayasul Haq. I'm Dean Faculty Management Science, Saraj University. I have some simple, straightforward question, and mostly I will say to be responded by Chief Economist, Planning and Development Division. During your discussion, you have touched upon those points. First of all, I see that you have mentioned that prices are rising, our currency is depreciated, and then we are taking policy measures. Where is our forecasting? Why we can't foresee these things in advance? Why it was not possible for us to see in about 3-4 months earlier that this current account deficit will re-emerge and we will not go to Saudi Arabia for help? There's absolutely missing anything about, we always go for a reactionary policies. When current account deficit arises, then we start talking about it. When inflation rises to this point, we start talking about it. I have yesterday seen there are some excellent macroeconomic models built by Pakistan Institute of Development Economics. Why we work together and forecast these things in advance and suggest policy measures well in advance to control these things. When we are always in the mess, we start making policies, and these policies will not work. My second point is, you have mentioned something about growth of Pakistan. Though you have, in a way, solved the problem, that it will be an intergenerational solution. It will take years and years, automatically growth will take place. I remember yesterday there was a presentation that during 1960 we achieved the highest investment GDP rate of 21%, and as a result there was 7.1% GDP growth. We have also similar high growth rate during 1980s, during their period, it was between 6% and 6.5%. We have again some kind of stability during around 2000 when Afghan war started. All these periods was dependent on flow of foreign aid from America. When we are going to stand on our own foot, can you tell me as a Chief Economist of Planning and Development Division, even today we are talking about game changer, CPEC. CPEC is from China, not from Pakistan. We always rely, we always look for help from outside. In 1965 to 1985, the first perspective plan was made that we will be no more dependent on foreign capital by 1985. Again, a perspective plan was made in 1988 to 2003 that we will get rid of foreign capital. And we are still standing at the same place, at the same problem. Still we are asking, Chinese will come to help us, Saudi Arabia will come to help us, and why America is not help us? When we are going to do to ourselves, what the Planning and Development Division is really doing? Has Planning and Development Division has any role in the economic development of Pakistan, or it is only looking for foreign aid always? Thank you very much. My question is a bit long, but it is straightforward.
Thank you. So maybe the last one. I'm taking fine.
Thank you so much. This is Ahmed Qazi from ILO Islamabad. I just have one question of clarity from Zubair Saab. Zubair Saab, you mentioned that under the new IMF program, I'll just stand up, I think. Under the new IMF program, some of the fiscal reliefs that were provided to the manufacturing sector, they might need to be revisited. I think you mentioned something like a little clarity on that. Do you refer to those 600 different new, the raw material tariff lines relief that were proposed under this budget, or a little more clarity on what kind of relief is being revisited under the new IMF program? Just a question of clarity on that, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to remind the topic of the session, some firms, and not too much on the microphone. So who would like to come on, maybe Zubair, I'd like to give you the floor first, because you got an important question on forecasting.
What was the lady over there?
Yes, so it was, there was her point was about the government, if I can summarize it, the government hurts markets whenever they intervene. And she gave the example of freelancers who are doing well, even if connectivity is, ownership of equipment is low, and now there's peak of taxing them. So
Thank you. I'll start with the first question from Ms. or Dr. Sara Zamani. The point I was making was basically in the context of the growth, given the initial results that we have observed in the fiscal year, first quarter of FY22, what are the likely growth drivers? And there I pointed out that it would be mostly from the agriculture sector and the services sector, in particular the IT. It is not that they are necessarily at the moment target of a very big investment program from the government side. The points that you have made, not only I agree, but the economic bureaucrats and the leadership, political leadership, are of the very firm view that those sectors which are growing or showing good performance, and they are doing it organically, there's no need to sort of touch them through some sort of support mechanism. So yes, I think on the whole, I agree with your points. Now, the second question from the gentleman here about price forecasting, inflation, intergenerational CPEC. सर मेरी सबमिशन है आपको, जो मैं आपको कह रहा था पहले शुरू में कि वी आर वेरी कंफ्यूज्ड। हमने सेविंग्स नहीं करनी, हमारी सेविंग्स हैं इस वक्त सर 9 या 10% ऑफ द जीडीपी, वन ऑफ द लोएस्ट अमंग द डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज। ठीक है, यानी हम 92-93% जो है ना वो करंट कंजप्शन अपना आउटपुट का खा पी के फारिग हो जाते हैं, जबकि आप बाकी किसी भी मुल्क का देख लें, ईस्ट एशिया का, साउथ एशिया का, सबकी सेविंग रेट जो है ना 15, 18, 20% प्लस हैं। तो पहले तो ये सोचें ना कि एज ए नेशन हमने अच्छा पहनना है, अच्छा रहना है, अच्छी गाड़ी चलानी है, यानी इस तरह से करना है, ये सेव करना है, क्योंकि इकोनॉमिक सॉल्वेनिटी आती है सेविंग्स से सर, मेरी राय में। आप यूएस एड पे डिपेंडेंट नहीं होंगे, आप सऊदी अरेबिया की एड पे डिपेंडेंट नहीं होंगे, आप चाइना के सीपैक पे डिपेंडेंट नहीं होंगे। आप अपना सेविंग रेट बढ़ाइए, बच्चे कम पैदा करें, पॉपुलेशन कंट्रोल करें, सेविंग्स रेट बढ़ाएं। जब तक सेविंग्स रेट नहीं बढ़ेगा, जो भी गवर्नमेंट हो, दे वुड हैव टू लुक फॉर दीज शॉर्ट टर्म पैलेटिव्स। सीपैक हो गया, अफगान वॉर हो गई, फलां फलां, जो भी मतलब उस वक्त का सीजन का अपॉर्चुनिटी है। तो वी एज अ नेशन, एज अ सोसाइटी हैव टू डिसाइड what kind of economic principles we need to follow. नेक्स्ट सवाल था IMF एग्जेम्पशंस के बारे में। मुझे उसके बारे में ज़्यादा नहीं मालूम, and I am not in a position to, even if I was in a position, I should not be answering that question. And I think the final question was about the IT sector. No, I think it was from...
Yeah,
sorry,
that was covered. Maybe just one point I'd like to answer, then I see Dr. Nadim has a question. I mean, first on your point, the gentleman of, yes, on barriers to trade and the delay to clear goods in the ports. I think this is in line with what we heard here in the panel, saying this is, instead of intervening, they're directly improving this kind of services of how fast goods are cleared will contribute to improve competitiveness. So totally agree with you. There was a question also on the interest rates that hurts investment. I'd like to make a point on this. It's a topic we haven't discussed here, which I think is critical for firms. It's access to credit. So yes, there's some elasticity of investment towards the level of interest rates, and it's a complicated question. There's trade-offs, and I won't comment on the monetary policy aspect of it. But the important thing, I think, which is more fundamental, is that credit markets and intermediation is not working in Pakistan. If you look at the profile and the number of firms who have access to credit for investment, many firms are excluded. So I think there's the price and cost of interest aspect to it, but the bigger problem, in my view, is how much the market is segmented and how intermediation is weak, in the sense that so many firms are just excluded. They don't even have access to that interest. They just don't have access to investment, to credit for investing or even working capital, probably because of lack of incentive of banks to lend to those segments. So I think that's a bigger issue, in my view, than the actual cost of interest in the functioning of credit markets. Nadim, you had a question.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have a question as much as a couple of comments that I want to raise. One is the whole debate between the market and the government. We at the PIDE have been trying to labor very hard to set the debate slightly differently. It's not markets or government, it's about the quality of both. And I think that's the message that Danny Roderick was giving yesterday too, and the message that many people have talked about, that somehow we have to get the quality of the government and the market going, and the determining factor is the government. I think so that's a very important thing to think about. And we've debated it, but we really don't take it seriously. How do we fix the government? And Danny talked about it a lot yesterday. How do we, and Mahbub in the morning, and day before yesterday, Atiq as well, that we need to get the structure of the state as well as the market in consonance with the technical change. And that brings me to the second point. We're looking at firms rather statically. That there's a firm and we take them, compare them across countries, which is a good econometric exercise done by the young lady from the bank. But the key thing is we need to look at our stock market carefully. And Naji, this relates to the comment you made too. We recently did an analysis of the KSC 100 using the balance sheet data. And we found something very interesting, that this is a very peculiar stock market, where the government firms dominate the market. The largest firms are the government firms. The second largest firms are the multinationals. British American Tobacco, for example, sometimes even larger than government firms. And British American Tobacco only has I think 1 or 2% interest here, the rest is outside. And some of the multinationals are even getting themselves removed from the stock market. They've been put into the stock market compulsorily. Our large firms are in the stock market, but they are owned by families, very small families. Mahbub Haq long time ago said it was 22 families. We have now looked at the stock market. There are 31 families own the stock market. So it's a very oligopolistic structure. And what are the barriers to competition? We try to understand that. One of the key issues is that the corporate governance structure here is very crony. There are a small number of bankers and a small number of retired civil servants or something who play the game of corporate governance. They jump from board to board. The boards are very well connected. When you looked at red network analysis, they are very well connected boards. So there's very little competition going on. The second thing that we note is there is really no corporate takeover market. That's why you have zombie firms, because the barriers to takeovers are very large. When we heard Atiq day before yesterday, a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, one of the most famous Pakistani entrepreneurs. He gave us his history where he jumped 10 firms. 5 of them have died. So there is a movement in the Dow Jones average and the S&P average, which we don't have here. We've got very static firms. Engro has been there through history, and so are other firms. So we have to figure out what is it that's keeping the market structure static. Zubair Saab also mentioned, Trab also mentioned, the market structure is very static. This is where we come in, that the role of the government is important. And both you and Naji and the chief economist also talked about credit. But our analysis suggests equity market may be more inefficient than the credit market. So we were looking at the Modigliani-Miller, which doesn't seem to work in Pakistan. Equity seems to be much more expensive than debt. Why is that? So does that indicate that interest rate should go up much more? Because when the market complains of interest rate rises, the large firms complain of interest rate rises, but they never seem to unlock their equity because they want to keep the family structure of the firm intact, right? So with the result that some firms, you don't find any equity trading on the market is very liquid. So I think we need to look at very deep regulatory and market issues before we can pronounce on that. And FDI, for example, again, as we said, CPEC. CPEC is a game changer. I've never understood how any project can be a game changer for a country. It's not policy, but project that we're talking about. And Zubair Saab says savings. I don't think savings are low in Pakistan. I think it's just recorded savings you're talking about, which are residual, which don't worry about the changes in wealth. True savings is changes in wealth. And if you look at changes in wealth, we may not be as bad a saver as people think we are. So there are lots of questions that need to be answered and discussed more seriously. Thank you.
Thank you. I can't agree more. On these good words, let me thank the panel for excellent interventions and the room as well for the good Q&A. I'm sorry for interrupting. We already passed the end time, but maybe we can take the question on the side, outside of the panel. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.